Good evening, everybody. I'm Mike Scott. I'm the Director of the Future of the Humanities Project, which is a Georgetown University project financed by Georgetown in DC, but takes place here in the UK in collaboration with Blackfriars Hall, the University of Oxford, and the Las Casas Institute, and that's an institute for human dignity. So, first thing I'd like to do is say welcome to you all. Thank you very much for coming. Second thing, I'd like to acknowledge the generosity of Georgetown University. Tom Banchoff, the Vice President, is sitting over there. He's the Vice President of Global Affairs. Jack DeGioia, the President of Georgetown University, sends his warmest wishes and hopes all the alumni here from Georgetown, hopes you're all well and are doing well. I'm actually Senior Advisor to President DeGioia, and I'm also running this project. The project is about exploring through a series of high-profile lectures, conferences, seminars, and symposium the place of the humanities in continuing to develop an understanding of human life, dignity, equality, and culture. Why are we doing it? We're doing it because on both sides of the Atlantic, the arts and the humanities, the social sciences, the freedom of speech, the notion of truth, all these things are under attack. And being under attack, we in the university sector have got to say, hang on. Every time we have one of these conferences, and we've had a number of very high-profile ones. We had one in Oxford with Professor Terry Eagleton. We had one at the Dulwich Picture Gallery with Gabriele Finaldi, the director of the National Gallery. We've got another one coming up next year on freedom of speech under global threat. Every time we have these conferences and the seminars that go with them and the symposium and the lectures that are going on in between, the big issue that comes up is truth. What is truth? When you attack language, you undermine the society. When truth becomes lies and lies become truth, society is in danger. That goes back to Tacitus. And it goes all the way through medieval literature, and it comes the way through Renaissance literature, and it's here today, I'm sure you realise, in our politics, so that people aren't sure what truth is anymore. And within that, there's the other thing. It's to do with equality, the equality of people, the equality of people, of human beings, one with another, regardless of gender, regardless of race, regardless of religious affiliation or none. It's the respect for each one of us as a member of our society, of who we are. People, individuals living our lives and trying to help others live their lives. That's what we're about, surely. Well, tonight we've got a most distinguished panel, and I'm going to leave it to Professor Evelyn Welch, the Provost here at King's College. And I'd like to thank King's College for hosting this tonight. And she's going to introduce the panel to you and introduce the topic to you. So my thanks to Georgetown, my thanks to the Las Casas Institute, and Dr. Richard Finn is sitting over there, who's the director of the Las Casas Institute, and my thanks to King's College as well. And Evelyn, a distinguished art historian and Renaissance scholar in her own right, and a great advocate for women in public life. Evelyn Welch.
Thank you very much. Thank you all so much, and welcome to Bush House in King's College London. It's a pleasure to host such a remarkable panel here this evening and to welcome you all as our guests there. Tonight, we're going to be talking about women in public life, transforming a culture, looking particularly at what the humanities, the sense of our past, present, and future, but all the social sciences can bring to bear on this topic there. The format is quite simple. We have a major speaker here, Gillard, the former Australian politician who served as the 27th Prime Minister of Australia and the leader of the Australian Labor Party from 2010 to 2013. I don't have time to read out the full list of her distinguishing remarks, her extraordinary contribution to women and girls' education there, but simply to point out that she was the first and to date the only woman to hold the positions of Deputy Prime Minister, and leader of a major party in Australia. Since her departure from politics, she became an honorary visiting professor at the University of Adelaide, a senior fellow at the Brookings Institute Centre for Universal Education, and she released her political memoir, My Story, in September 2014. She served as the chairman of the Global Partnership for Education, and since February 2015, she's been the patron of the John Curtin Prime Ministerial Library. On the 30th of June 2015, she was conferred a fellowship from Aberystwyth University, and in September 2016, she was appointed a visiting professor at King's College London, joining the Policy Institute to chair the Global Institute for Women's Leadership there. In 2017, Julia Gillard was appointed a Companion of the Order of Australia. She will start the proceedings, and then we will have short 5-minute follow-ups from the rest of our panel here. Baroness Goudie, Mary Goudie, there is a Labour member of the House of Lords. In 1998, she was made a life peer. She is on the board of Vital Voices Global Partnership and is involved in promoting gender equity with both the G8 and G20. She works in the House of Lords to actively promote the issues of women and children. She's vice chair of the All-Parliamentary Equality Group. She's an advisor to the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace and Security, which examines and highlights the roles and experiences of women in peace and security worldwide there. She's a founding member of the 30% Club there. Then Baroness Prosser, Margaret Prosser, who will speak next after Mary, became active in the Labour Party and trade union movement in the early 1970s, rising through the ranks of the Transport and General Workers Union to become Deputy General Secretary in 1998, and she was President of the Trade Unions Congress in 1996. She was a member of the Equal Opportunities Commission, the Low Pay Commission, and appointed an OBE in the 1997 birthday honours. On 11th June 2004, she was created Baroness Prosser of Battersea. And from 2004 to 2010, she was the non-executive director of Royal Mail there. As of 2019, Baroness Prosser is the chair of the Board of Trustees of the Industry and Parliament Trust, which works to promote an understanding of business amongst parliamentarians and policymakers. Professor Rosie Campbell is a professor of politics at King's College. Previously, she was a professor at UCL and Birkbeck College. She's a specialist in public expectations of politicians and voting behaviour, and has recently written on barriers to participation in politics, gendered patterns of support for the populist radical right, and what voters want from their elected representatives. I hope you see that we have an extraordinary range of experiences and expertise to start us off on this conversation about women in public life transforming a culture. Once we've heard from each of the panel members, I'll ask them perhaps to say 1 or 2 words about what they've heard from each other, and then open it up to you for questions. So please do listen attentively and prepare your questions now. Julia, over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to Evelyn for that kind introduction. There's no exam at the end, so hopefully you will listen attentively, but you won't be under any exam pressure at the end. Could I also thank Mike, who's really been the driving force for bringing us all here, and through him thank all of the partners that have made this possible. Thank you so much, and to everyone who's been involved, thank you for all of your efforts. Of course, I would like to be able to tell you that we are so smart that when we settled on this date a number of months ago, we knew that it would coincide with the British election campaign. But of course, the truth is, whilst all of the institutions you've heard mentioned tonight have very good political scholars, I'm not sure that anybody had quite as good enough crystal ball to foresee that we would be meeting during the British election campaign. However, I do think that coincidence of timing gives some new urgency to the discussions that we're going to have tonight. Already in this election campaign, 18 women members have announced that they will not be recontesting the next election. Now, while that number is not disproportionate to the number of male MPs who have also said that they wouldn't stand again, what is different is the stage of their careers that women are exiting. Of the 18 women, 9 have served as MPs for less than 10 years and 3 have served for less than 5 years. What is also different is the reason women are giving for leaving. Several of the female MPs standing down, Heidi Allen, Nikki Morgan, Carolyn Spielman, have cited the abuse received as a factor in their decision. And anecdotally, it seems that for many more of the 18 that are standing aside, that has played a significant part. Now, abuse of politicians is not a new phenomenon, but the unprecedented levels and the violent and misogynistic nature of the abuse is clearly having an impact. This loss of women means there is a real risk that at this election, the representation of women in Parliament will go backwards. Now, in gender discussions, we frequently talk about the role modelling effect, that you can't be it if you can't see it, that it's important for girls to see women in politics, to see women prime ministers, so that they know that this is a potential life path for them. At the Global Institute for Women's Leadership, we consider this phenomenon is so important that we have a particular research project dedicated to studying it. However, in the light of the number of women exiting politics and their reasons for doing so, I ask you to ponder, what is it that we are role modelling now? Tonight, in the lead up to our panel discussion, I want to unpack some of the contemporary environment aspects for women in politics. Before I do, let me remind you that women are still very much in the minority in the parliaments of the world. As we meet today, less than 25% of parliamentarians are women, and less than 7% of heads of state and heads of government are women. Depressingly, the World Economic Forum tells us that at current rates of change, it will be 107 years before we close the gap in women's political empowerment. Of course, our topic of women in public life is broader than women in elected office, but given the pressures, partisanship and hothouse environment of Parliament, I believe that what is happening to women in politics gives us the most dramatic example of the trends elsewhere. Given getting your message across to voters and winning their support is the lifeblood of politics, I turn first to the question of whether women politicians are being fairly reported in the traditional media. Here you are probably expecting some happy news, assuming that as understanding of gender bias has grown, newspapers and broadcasters have changed practices to ensure fair and equal treatment of women. And there is some good news, such as the BBC's 50-50 project, which aims to balance up the representation of women on television and radio. But that one bright spot is in a darker picture. The Global Institute for Women's Leadership has promoted research by Blair Williams, a PhD candidate at the Australian National University. Blair compares the media reaction to the second female Prime Minister of the UK, Prime Minister May, against the reaction to the first, Prime Minister Thatcher, and finds the coverage is more gendered now than it was then. For example, she finds the tabloid newspaper, the Daily Telegraph, mentioned May's gender the most in 68% of its articles compared to 36% for Thatcher. She also found references to May's appearance happened twice as often as references to Thatcher's appearance, and that the problem was worst in the Conservative press. The Daily Telegraph discussion of appearance markedly increased from 19% to 43%, while the Sun also doubled from 12% for Thatcher to 24% for May. Now, I don't think we can conclude from Blair's research that gender stereotypes about political leadership are more firmly in people's heads today than they were in 1979, when Margaret Thatcher first became Prime Minister. Rather, I suspect Blair's result may well be a reflection that reporting of political leaders now is more no holds barred, and that the inherent sense of respect for the office of PM, which prevented some things being said in the late 1970s, no longer applies. But whatever the cause, the fact that we are immersed in a more gendered, not less gendered reporting environment should concern us. For everyone who today reads a newspaper, there are many more who glean all of their political news and views online. Here, as is now commonly discussed, the environment for women is toxic, with women routinely looking down at Twitter or Facebook and seeing death and rape threats. The sheer volume of abuse is staggering. Amnesty International released a study of tweets in the UK at the end of last year. It found that a woman is abused on Twitter every 30 seconds, with 1.1 million abusive or problematic tweets sent to women in 2018. For women in politics, the study found that while abuse happened across the political spectrum, black women were disproportionately targeted. Much of this content is too violent and ugly for me to want to read any of it out tonight. But given we are welcoming Hillary Clinton to King's College later this week, let me cite one study involving her to share a sense of what it's like. The Washington Post analysed 100,000 tweets from the time that Hillary was contesting against Bernie Sanders for the New Hampshire primary. The Post study found the most gendered words used about Mrs. Clinton were a common swear word starting with B, a reference to her sexual organs, including a word starting with C, and the term rapist, including threats that she should be raped. For Mr. Sanders, dad and basketball were as gendered as it got. The sheer volume and coarseness of this bile leaves us grappling with the question, was there always this level of misogyny directed at women in the public square, but prior to social media, it had no easy means of expression? Or are things, in fact, getting worse? I don't know the answer to that, but I think we need to combine our analysis of the apparent rage against women in the online environment with our knowledge of the penalties paid when women step outside accepted cultural stereotypes. To explain that, let me start with a story. I ask you to imagine a young would-be politician in her mid-40s who agrees to do a profile piece with a magazine. Her intention is to use this piece to announce her ambition to be the next Prime Minister. This isn't her first foray into national politics. She had recently fought a very high-profile seat and lost. She followed that defeat with a period of soul-searching, leaving her husband and children at home while she travelled and publicly documented her 3-month sabbatical. But now she's ready. It's time. She proudly proclaims to the journalist, "I want to be in it. Man, I was just born to be in it. You can probably tell that I want to run. I do. I think I'll be good at it." The magazine runs these words on the cover with a shot of the politician. To prepare for the taking of that image, she has done nothing. She has let her hair dry naturally without styling it. She wears no makeup, and she's clothed in a plain buttoned shirt and chinos. How do we think the public would react to all of this? Would voters conclude that this woman has got the right stuff to be leader? Or do we think the reaction would be, what kind of mother abandons her children for 3 months? Why does she look such a mess? Doesn't she own a hairdryer, a lipstick? How up herself is she? How cold? How grasping? Of course, this isn't really a story about a female politician. It's about Beto O'Rourke, who was one of the Democrat contenders for the US presidential nomination. Now, he's withdrawn for the campaign for reasons not directly related to that article. However, Beto certainly faced some flack over the article. In particular, the Twitterverse shredded him for the statement, "Man, I was born to be in it." But he wasn't pummeled for looking casual and natural. The criticism of him going on a journey of self-discovery after his defeat in the Senate election in Texas was muted. People were not saying, "How dare he aspire?" He was not vilified for saying he would be good at being president. My case to you tonight is that the real price a woman would pay for owning ambition the way Beto owned it would be a backlash of rage. This was laid bare by an experiment conducted by Yale University in which reactions to male and female political candidates who expressed different levels of ambition was measured. The researchers concluded, and I quote, "Voting preferences for female candidates were negatively influenced by her power-seeking intentions, actual or perceived, but the preferences for male candidates were unaffected by power-seeking intentions. This happens because we are all subject to unconscious bias and the gender stereotypes that pervade our culture. They whisper to us that we should expect women to put others first and act communally rather than being individually power-hungry. We not only associate that putting others first as a character trait of women, research shows we mark women down if they do not exhibit it. In the words of the Yale study, the presence of moral, emotional and avoidant reactions, moral outrage reactions of contempt, disdain, anger, irritation, disapproval, disgust and revulsion suggests that the power-seeking aspirations of the female politician were not just unexpected, but also seen as wrong. That list of reactions is worth saying twice. Contempt, disgust, revulsion are mind-bogglingly strong words. Once again, let's use a Hillary Clinton example to show how this plays out in the real world. You would recall Clinton was plagued by criticisms of being unlikable, of being too cold, too distant, too ambitious. A columnist from the New York Times wrote, "Clinton gives off an exclusively professional vibe, industrious, calculated, goal-oriented, distrustful. It's hard from the outside to have a sense of her as a person. She is a role. To many, she seems Machiavellian, crafty, power-orientated, untrustworthy." Now, reacting to words like that, I seriously don't know whether to laugh or cry. Apparently, being hard-working and professional is a liability for a woman. And where were all the opinion pieces telling us Donald Trump's very ambition to be president and pursuit of that outcome made him inherently unlikable? These words from a commentator help us see the narrow path women leaders have to try and walk. If she is funny and jokes around, then people will say, "Silly girl, why does she think she can run the country? She's frivolous, flighty." Too stern and serious, then people think you're cold and hard. Ambitious, hard-working, you are untrustworthy, ruthless, devoid of personality. But drift too far the other way and people will say that you can't handle the pressure. You won't cut it. You're too soft, too emotional. So far, I'm conscious I've defined problems, not solutions. Let me chance my arm on a few potential action points, but before doing so, particularly in the halls of this great institution of learning, I should stress that when it comes to gender equality, including for women in public life, we need much more research. Yes, there are some things we know and we can state them with confidence and cite the evidence. But disturbingly, there is much that we do not know, where the evidence does not exist. The mission of the Global Institute for Women's Leadership is to change that picture, broaden the evidence base, and get the strategies that work into the hands of policymakers and activists. Unfortunately, the evidence vacuum has been filled by guesswork and mythology. This has led to lots of attempts to fix the women rather than fix the system. Women are told to lean in, to fake it till you make it. Leadership seminars train confidence, assertiveness, proud stature, strong body language. Women are told they aren't assertive enough in meetings, that they apologise too much, that they should stop moderating their expression in emails, that they should be tougher. We are told that the pay gap exists because women lack the confidence to ask for more money and that they don't really want or don't have the drive for the hard jobs. Held up to the light, this is all revealed to be nonsense. To take one example, our Global Institute advised LinkedIn on research that examined the reactions of different genders to language in the workplace, as well as what women and men look for when applying for jobs. What the research found was that there was very little difference in what people are looking for in a workplace. It suggests that both men and women want good salaries and work-life balance. Our researcher, Laura Jones, concluded that we need to abandon the idea that any difference in negotiations for jobs is down to a lack of confidence, and that the advice for women to behave more like men in order to receive the same rewards not only misdiagnoses the problem, it also prescribes a solution that, given the reaction we have discussed to assertiveness in women, could do more harm than good. So, what are some potential real solutions? First, traditional media can and should clean up its act on gender. Between the intervention of human editors and even the use of AI tools to surface gender problems in copy and scripts, it ought to be possible to eradicate bias before a report goes live. Second, the social media industry, which after all is a limited number of very powerful players, should clean up its act. I am by no means an expert, but it seems to me, given all the technological wizardry in the hands of Facebook and Twitter, that it must be possible to find ways to moderate out threats of violence and misogyny. Third, and this seems to me the most complex, we must seize on this moment when gender has been so much at the forefront of public discussion, including in the context of the election campaign, to challenge and debunk gender stereotypes. Until we eradicate unconscious bias against women exercising power, we will be condemned to the same gendered dialogue and outcomes. Let me conclude where I began, thanking Evelyn and Mike, but also thanking you all for turning up tonight and showing an interest in this very important topic, and I'm very much looking forward to the panel discussion to come. Thank you very much.
Julia, thank you for laying that challenging perspective out before us. Mary.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Julia. I think you summed up the situation as it is today. My name is Mary Goudie. I've said earlier I'm a member of the House of Lords and work on a number of issues that was mentioned earlier. But in particular, I've been working on women, peace and security and why it's important that we have women at the peace table globally. And without women at every table, women are not going to succeed, nor are men and children. And we have to imagine a world that every table, we have to have women and men working together at every level. And until we can push, it's not until, it's now that we have to push that. And what's happening just now is I've asked various friends, including members of the staff of Georgetown University in Georgetown, why is it? What is it, men, and it's women too, who are afraid of what women in power and women having equal power, what is it that they fear? What is it they're going to miss out on if we're at the table or if we're running countries, running businesses? There are many successful businesses globally run by women in this country. And if you look at the amount of women who are also now having hate crime against them, is women running senior NGOs. And those NGOs are employing a huge amount of people both here and around the world, and have a huge balance financially that they're turning over and are confident of running it. So what we have to ask ourselves, what is the fear of women in power? That's the real issue. And that is an issue that we have to change or cut back I've never thought, and I think Margaret and Julia would think, that we're sitting today about us being pushed back instead of being pushed forward. I think that's really important. And I do think one thing, and I'll finish this because I really love questions, is that Julia's right. All these courses are great. Mentoring and sponsorship and so on are great. But that only works if everybody will agree to one thing. Men and women working together, we will succeed and have a much better world.
Thank you very much. Margaret.
Thank you very much. My name's Margaret Prosser. I'm also in the House of Lords alongside Mary Goudie, and my background is rather different. I was involved in the trade union movement for many years, so it was me and the boys in the Transport and General Workers Union. At one point, we had over 400 paid organisers, only 4 of whom were women. So it kind of was a little bit of a struggle sometimes. There was one good thing always about that. There was never a queue for the ladies' toilet. So you always have to look on the bright side. I'm grateful to Julia for the breadth of her contribution. Clearly, getting women into positions of influence and power is hugely important. What happens when they get there is equally important. But unless we get women there in the first place, then we're not really off the starting blocks. I was always supportive of the policy which was introduced by the Labour government in 1997, in the run-up to the 97 election, of all women shortlists. It was controversial at the time, but actually in the 97 election, 101 Labour women were elected to become members of Parliament, which was absolutely unheard of at the time. Now, not everything, of course, in the garden is rosy since then. Harriet Harman, who was already in Parliament, she came in under the original schemes. She worked tirelessly over a long number of years to try to get Parliament to change its hours, to introduce a creche, to give proper maternity leave to women MPs. And a lot of that has been quite successful. But actually, I had my eyes opened only recently. I've been, for some reason or another, I've been put on this WhatsApp group, which is mostly for Labour MPs who are what you might call the kind of sensible middle section. And there was some concern they were expressing that there might be a late night sitting. The only people who participated in this WhatsApp exchange about the late night sitting were the women MPs. Now, lots of the men who are part of that WhatsApp group contribute regularly, but somehow or another, despite the fact that I know many of them have got small children, not one of them seemed to be concerned about the late night sitting. So there's a mile and a half to go between actually getting women into positions and actually then having people around who understand what that means, they understand the need for certain changes, allowances to take place so that people with families, not just women, but men with families also, can properly participate. And just one final word about Julia's comments about the media reaction, the difference in the media reaction between Theresa May and Margaret Thatcher. The Daily Telegraph, at the time when Margaret Thatcher was Prime Minister, was a huge supporter of Margaret Thatcher, of her policies, her attitudes, her approach to the future of the country. Not so with Theresa May. Now, I think where the sexist bit comes in is that they identified Theresa May as being a weaker character, a bit like chasing the pack and identifying which one of them is the weakest of them. They never in a million years would have criticised Margaret Thatcher in that way, partly because they were supportive of her, partly also because she just would not have put up with it. She behaved like a man, and that's partly why lots of people liked her and didn't criticise her, because she didn't exercise the kind of usual traits of women of being, you know, kind of like all the things that we know about, like, you know, kind of stepping back a bit and not pushing yourself, etc. That was not her style at all. So it's interesting that the media not only finds itself very easily being critical of women and the different ways in which women operate, but they also are quite happy to be very supportive if they see a woman who behaves like a man and they see her as one of their own. So there's a whole range of different layers of issues that are going on here that really need addressing. And the one thing I always say about work on equality, never take your foot off the pedal because you'll roll backwards. So we just have to keep on pushing in order to keep on trying to go forwards. Thank you.
And finally, Rosie Campbell.
In the theme of these panels that you're having around the future of the social sciences and so on, I know that in the US there's been a real threat to political science funding in particular, and I have been running a candidate survey of all the parliamentary candidates that stand for election in the UK for the last 3 elections. And the Economic and Social Research Council, so government funded but an arm's distance, has funded that research. And that research has allowed us to gather evidence from candidates. About 51% of all candidates complete the survey, where we found that women reported receiving harassment and abuse, about 37% of women compared to 30% of men. So we saw a gender gap, but we also saw a large number of men receiving threats and intimidation. But importantly, women were more likely, it'd be no surprise to you, to receive threats of a sexual and particularly violent nature. And having that data allowed us to give evidence to the Committee on Standards in Public Life that allowed us to cut through with some truth in the debate. And I think that is so important that we have academic research that is rigorous, that tries to look at whether this is affecting both parties, which it was, which tries to really quantify, is there a difference for men and women? Is it of a different quality? And actually is able to really inject into the debate that information. And you can't do it without money. I mean, to get those candidate surveys out, to get them inputted, to do the analysis requires a serious investment. And so I think it's so important that we continue to defend the research that we do so that we can actually have some truth out there in these debates that we have. I think the harassment and intimidation of politicians and its disproportionate impact on women, of course, is one of the reasons that we've seen a greater proportion of conservative, younger women politicians stepping away from political life. But there's also another important factor, and it's the hollowing out of the centre in politics, with extremes on both sides and a polarised politics. And research that I've done with colleagues shows that women are more likely to be what you called, and I wouldn't dare say that, the sensible centre politicians. And women, you know, for example, if you look at support for parties of the populist radical right across Europe and globally, women are much less likely to support those parties. Women are slightly more likely to support the Green Party than men, significantly less likely to support the Brexit Party. So we see this polarisation, and women are more likely to be in the centre of that. And so when we've seen the Conservative Party to shift to the right on some issues, then also that's part of why, as moderate Conservative MPs have been leaving the House, we see a greater proportion of women among them than we might expect. Another thing, a comment that you made, Mary, was about the fact that we didn't expect to see us rolling back in terms of women's participation in politics. And I have conducted a review of the Fabian Women's Mentoring and Political Education Programme for the last 8 years. And when I started, I've finished now, but when I started doing that, it was all talking about confidence building and getting out there. In the last report, I'm afraid we had got to the point where the women in this programme were talking about how they needed a safe space. They needed a safe space away from their constituency parties, which are sometimes very toxic environments. And they needed a safe space with other women where they could talk about the intimidation and other things that they were experiencing. That was a really eye-opening moment for me that I had never, in the 8 years that I had been running this programme, the evaluation, had those kind of comments until the last 2 years. So I really do think the nature of politics in that regard is changing. And so Julia mentioned mentoring and how important it is, but we have to think hard about how do women politicians, how do they work as mentors in this toxified environment? And there's a lovely study by Ian McAllister in Australia who looked at when Julia was in office. And when Julia was in office, young women's interest and engagement in politics increased. Sadly, when she left, it decreased again. So we know that having women in politics makes a difference, but the messaging is going to be increasingly important, I think. If we see women in politics and they're being vilified and targeted, it makes things very difficult. And I think the initiatives that mean that actually when we see someone being attacked on Twitter, for example, that there's a reverse collective action where women and men together stamp in to show that this is a minority activity is really important. If we can organise in that way, it will make a really big difference. And the message that we give women about leaning in, being more confident, being more resilient. Actually, I think Jess Phillips standing up and saying, getting threats against my children, getting threats against my life, getting threats against my family, it's tiring, and I sometimes feel like crying. Actually, that shows you that you don't have to be a superhuman to be a politician. You have to have superhuman networks and support, and you have to have an infrastructure of other politicians and other friends and family who will help and support you. And if we show women role models of these super women, that's not going to work. We actually need real strategies for how can you get involved in politics and still be safe. And we know, the point that you made about quotas, we know that the all-women shortlists really worked. And until we had all-women shortlists, the argument would always be, oh, there just aren't enough women, they're not interested.
They don't come forward.
They don't come forward. This happens all over at different sectors. I was recently at a conference of leading scientists where they had said that actually if they come back with a panel for an interview and there are not a third good qualified women, they say, we will not put this job forward. You will not get this post in your department. Suddenly, these women appear, and that's because the team doing the recruiting have gone back and they've talked to people and they've found out who's good and they've really put the hard legwork into finding those women. It's made a massive difference. So supply is a function of demand. We have to create the demand for women, and lo and behold, they appear.
Thank you very much. Now, this panel is very much about transforming culture. Yeah. And much of the political discussion and debate that we're talking about sits within a deep-rooted Western European culture where we have Medusa or Aphrodite or Cleopatra, or we have these humanist tropes of evil or absolutely magnificent women, which Queen Elizabeth and other women in authority have always navigated. Could I ask you, before we open it up to the questions, just to say one or two words perhaps on what you've heard, but also about this really key issue about how we reimagine the female politician there as a human being first there, and how that fits within that kind of deeper cultural roots that you experience.
It's a very complicated question, Evelyn. I mean, answering that from the Australian perspective, a noted Australian feminist and author, Anne Summers, started her career by authoring a work called Damned Whores and God's Police. And it was an analysis of the role of women at the time that people from the United Kingdom first came to Australia and established a colony there. And she pointed to the dichotomy that in that emerging society, there were only two roles. Either you were a good woman or you were a damned whore. There was nothing in between. You were a good woman or a bad woman. And I think that imagery, it's changed over the many years in between, but in some ways it's still with us, this dichotomy of good and bad women. And it's quite hard for a woman who is in politics, exercising power, and, you know, as Tony Blair was wont to say when he was Prime Minister, if you decide, you divide, you know, there will be people who agree with you, people who disagree with you. It's quite hard for a woman who is exercising that kind of power to be continuously put in the good woman category. And so until we diversify the range of ways of being a woman and being understood to be a woman in our societies, then it gets more and more difficult for women who are leading to be able to show all aspects of themselves and their personality, which, you know, for any human being generally tends to be a little bit good and a little bit bad. People are a mix of strengths and weaknesses. No one gets everything right, but that complexity gets lost in the translation.
I think, coming on from what Julia said about good and bad women, one of the things that, if we bring it to the UK Parliament, is that we've seen since 1997, the way Parliament has changed in terms of electing now the chairman of all the major committees. And through that, we have seen women elected by men and women across the political divide. And they are doing fantastic work. If you look at those reports, if you look at the way they've cross-examined with assistants, pulling the committee with them to show what's wrong and what's right. But what is very bad is that when they're reported in the press, it talks about woman chairman, where a man does this, it's just, oh, it's great. Oh, she cross-examined and it's this. And so it is the good and the bad. And they've got to understand that women stand tall and can do these jobs just as well. And they're elected by a cross-section in Parliament. I think that is showing how there is that change, but the change will slip back unless we get women elected, because there won't be enough or people prepared to put themselves forward for that election within the parliamentary system, because it takes up a lot of time. You know, so
A real warning to us.
yes, it is a real warning, and that's why I take from what Julia was saying about good and bad. So we then will get that because women or good women won't be able to come forward, or there's too many jobs and not enough women there. And just on this whole question of women not standing this time, it is disgraceful that certain women have felt that because of what's happening outside, they can't stand, and other women who were going to stand are now not standing. It's a real...
I think we have to be careful not to confuse the bad behaviour and the rudeness and the kind of boorish behaviour of some people in public life with the fact that actually being a politician is quite tough. So you do have to be able to get on with it. You do have to be able to stick up for yourself. But you don't have to do that in a way that's spiteful or putting people down or making somebody feel small to make yourself look a bit bigger. Those kinds of, you can be tough, you can be determined, you can get people to come with you for ideas and changes, etc., by actually being nice to people and bringing people with you. I wouldn't want, if we were having this argument out with the great British public, I wouldn't want people to think that we're saying that politics is a soft option and therefore, because women are perceived to be less bullish than men, that we want politics to be soft like that, because it never is going to be soft, because it's tough. But being tough doesn't mean it has to be rude and nasty and boorish.
Well, I think, Evelyn, you've hit the nail on the head with the core problem that has been referred to about how history is written and rewritten and how women's voices are often written out. And if we think about where our myths and our stories come from, you think about the women who were active in the early Christian church who were then written out, or the mother gods who were then described as witches, and how actually who is the author? And when the author is exclusively men, women tend to be used for illustrative purposes. This is how to be a good woman, be the Madonna, don't be the whore. And this happens repeatedly over and over again, as long as the default voice, be that as the human, the citizen, the voter, the politician, is male, until we can make the argument, which should be easy to make, that women are 51% of the adult population in the UK, the average voter is a woman, until we can get to that point where we actually, Caroline Credo Perez's book, where she shows that women are 17% more likely to die in a car crash because the crash test dummies have been male crash test dummies, until these things no longer happen and we realise that human beings come in two basic kinds, we're just going to keep rewriting history this way over and over again.
Thank you. Well, that's certainly given us plenty to start the discussion, questions and debate on there. So now I'm going to turn it over to the audience there, to you, for questions there. And I'm going to suggest that we take perhaps one or two at a time there. And then I'll do it. We've got 1, 2, 3. We'll start on this side there. So if you start in the back, and then we'll take 3 at a time, and then we'll come over to this side, and then we'll go over there, and then we'll come back there.
It's a plan.
It's a plan, absolutely. So we're going to take 3 at a time so that we can get in as many as possible.
Can you tell us who you are?
If you just say who you are.
My name is Linda Funke, and I went to Georgetown, among other things. I'm also the deputy chair of the Elton John AIDS Foundation. And I'm very interested in all of the topics that you're talking about, because one of the things that we work on is inclusive leadership. I wanted to, you all have given us a view of women in the, I wanted to pick up on the point of the pipeline of women in politics. And you've said it, that women are leaving politics, and that many of them are also afraid to jump in right now. And Ms. Campbell, you mentioned also that there's a real need for data and research. In the United States, there's been some recent research that has come out that says that the system in the United States, which allows for people to win just by a plurality, not by having a majority or a simple majority at the different levels of the political system, so that we don't have runoffs, we don't have ranked choice voting, we do have people that draw maps for themselves. But the point is that there's no ranked choice voting, et cetera. So it means that politicians can win, that are winning based upon just a plurality, a certain percentage of voters within their district, and that this has led to increased polarization and a lack of innovation both in politics and in the political economy more broadly. I'm wondering if perhaps the reason that women in the UK aren't finding themselves in the political system here due to this extremism could be driven by the particular electoral system here, the first past the post system.
Brilliant, thank you. Rosie, hang on to that question. Then we have another, and then I'm going to come to you. If you just say who you are.
You'd be pleased to. I'm Nadine Waddell. I'm a teacher. You'd be pleased to hear that I kind of dovetail a little bit with that question. First of all, thank you very much. I feel it's important to mention Jo Cox this evening. It's hard to have these discussions without thinking about her. When you have a Prime Minister whose response is humbug to women raising this issue in Parliament and using language like girly swat, and when you have an MP who tackles a woman by the throat and the inquiry is suspended by the current Prime Minister, I wonder if politics is going to the extreme, then maybe the women should be thinking about being a bit more extreme, such as the suffragettes. And it's a playful question, really, to you. Should women leave the field? Should we, to use an art history term, make our salon de refusé? Should we not continue to be part of this male-dominated system, which is evidently failing? And should we set up a women's parliament and start all over again? And perhaps proportional representation is part of that. But in a sort of playful way, I'm just interested in knowing whether or not you think we're being too polite and we're operating too much within a male system and we should throw the whole lot out.
So that one's from Mary and Margaret, I think.
Hi, my name is Christine Brown Quinn, Georgetown alum and also author on women in business. My question's much more simple. About the research, I'm wondering, particularly around the backlash, do we have any research on what stands behind that backlash in terms of demographics? Is it male or female? I mean, the brain kind of says, oh, well, it's got to be males. But are there also women criticizing women that are in public office? And are there any other demographics? The reason being, maybe that will help us to identify what is the fear, what's driving those individuals with that behavior, and then address it in that way.
Do you feel? So, Rosie.
I mean, plurality systems, there is some research showing that it can be easier to get more representation of women in proportional representation systems. But although we have seen some high-profile women leaving the field, the representation of women in the British House of Commons is 32%, and that masks a lot of variation by party. In the Labour Party, it's something like 45%, and in the Conservative, it's 20-something. The reason for that is the Labour Party uses a quota, or women shortlists, in terms of the selection of candidates. That happens in lots of countries around the world, either at a national level, legislative level, or party level. It doesn't happen in the United States. That's a cultural issue. That's not to do with the system.
Mary, Margaret, are we too polite? And when somebody calls us a girly swat, should we just walk out of the room and set up our own girly swat parliament?
No. Margaret, you go first. I'll come after.
Some people have commented on the fact that I have an injured hand and have wondered whether that injury came about by punching one of these people on the nose. And quite frankly, I feel tempted. And really, you know, that kind of language from the Prime Minister, it's so completely inappropriate. It leads to encouragement of other people to speak badly and to be so rude and vulgar. But actually leaving the whole system to the men, no, certainly not. I mean, it will carry on. If women said we're not going to be involved, the British Parliament's not going to collapse. It will carry on just with the men. So why would we want to do that? That we have the Women's Party, which actually has not done at all well. It's really not made a mark at all. And, you know, I just think this Parliament belongs to me. The Labour Party belongs to me just as much as it does those people who are currently active in it, who don't really follow what the kind of true beliefs of the Labour Party. The Parliament belongs to me just as much as it does to anybody else or any of us here. So I'm not going anywhere, I tell you, I'm staying.
I'd like to support Margaret. I feel that Parliament, I'd like to see it a bit more, more women elected in Parliament, and that comes back to the party system. And in the House of Lords, I have a number of times when we've had debates on gender, have asked the leaders of the Tory party who tell us that they're working hard, and the Liberal Party, to get more women candidates. And we say, well, why won't you, for the next election, have a quota system? We're not asking you for this forever, but why don't you just try the next election? Why don't you go to the Prime Minister? Why don't you go to the Chairman of the Conservative Party and ask for this? And they will not come to the table on this. Where the Liberals play around and of course, the Labour Party is doing this, because it is the parties that make that decision. The parties choose the candidates. They do the runoffs within the constituency and within the branches, within the trade union and all the other affiliated bodies. And it is through the party system, and we have to get that system to be much better. I'm not in favour of all men's or all women's associations. I never have been, and fought, like Margaret, to get equality at every level and women to be allowed in everywhere, So I'm afraid. And there are policies that can be for women, and one's helped to push those forward. But at the end of the day, as I've said many times, it's men and women working together, because we need to get young men to respect women as well. Just on the one question, and I don't know how Rosie's researching that, is that my view that some of the trolling and so on has been through extreme right-wing men.
Yeah.
Some that we've been able to trace a bit through people who know much more than me. But I haven't got any sound evidence for that. But there seems to be a fear by some of those men, or find it great game. It's the latest game to play against us.
Really, the backlash. You have senior female or indeed senior black politicians, and people say, yes, we're going forward. And then suddenly, it just doesn't look like that anymore.
Yeah.
Where is it coming from?
I think this is a very important question as to, what's the issue behind the issue, what is feeding in to the sort of apparent rage that we're seeing and backlash against women and others in politics and more generally. And I've got two quick answers to that. We could have a whole session on that, but the two quick answers. We live in an era of rapid and, for many, discomforting change, and that change has left lots of communities behind. And so they felt the pressures coming from globalisation, they felt the pressures coming from austerity, they feel like no one understands them and their lives anymore or cares about them and their lives, and so that understandably animates a backlash. And once people are angry, I mean, we know this from our own personal lives. If you head up about something, then, you know, the person who might end up being the one that you take that anger out on might not be the person who caused you to get head up. I think we see that phenomenon in politics too. So all of that has put pressure on people and it's fueling anger. And then at the same time that we've had that absolutely real world phenomenon, we've had such a dramatic change in the information industry, in the media industry. So we're now in a time where it is easier than it has ever been to get your information in a way which constantly reinforces your own biases. You don't ever have to trip over a piece of information that forces you to confront your biases if you don't want to. And the loss of sort of shared facts and shared underlying truths as a result of that is fracturing and multiplying the anger at the same time that the real world circumstances of globalisation and austerity have caused the anger. And so, you know, one of the sort of things I've asked people to do is in Australia, the Vietnam War was a hugely divisive thing. There was conscription, young men were being sent to Vietnam, many of them died on the battlefields there. And so huge demonstrations against conscription, very divisive debate. But if you look at that era, you know, a family would be watching the television footage from Vietnam on the 6 o'clock news, and the father and the son at risk of conscription might come to diametrically opposed views about the merits of the war, but they were watching the same footage. You couldn't get away from the fact that this was the footage from Vietnam. Now, because of the scattered way that we get our information, it is possible for people to completely believe diametrically opposed things about real world events. And so we haven't even got a consensus on the underlying facts, let alone a consensus about what we're going to do with them. So all of that, I think, is in the mix, and it fuels anger, and anger fuels the toxicity.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to take some questions from this side of the room in a moment, and I'll come back to you in a bit. We have 1, 2, 3. So we'll start with the 3 questions there, and then you, and there's a question there. But we'll do that first 3 first.
Hi, my name is Tetsu Shikawa. I'm here with my wife at Georgetown, but it's a very, very interesting conversation, and thank you very much. There was mention of requiring traditional media to clean up, because a lot of the information that society gets comes through traditional media. And there was mention of using technology and AI and all the wonderful things that I can't possibly understand to help identify bias. To drive real change, do you think that imposing real financial, meaningful penalties on media reporting will drive change? And is that something that is acceptable in the broader debates of restrictions on freedom of speech and freedom of reporting?
Sheila, I ask you to take that one. Then we've got another question just over here.
Catherine Curl, Georgetown alum. Just a very quick question. To what extent do you think that this misogyny derives from fear of women's power, and that our very success up to this point has carried the seeds of its own destruction? Empires never die quietly.
I might ask you to have a follow-on, and then we'll get everyone to speak to that one. And then there's another question there.
Hello, good evening. My name is Rosie. I am a graduate of Georgetown University School of Foreign Service and have just moved back from Sydney, where I worked for Amnesty International and was part of Amnesty's Australian campaign against Twitter to get it to enforce its own policies on tackling abuse of women online. And I say that long preamble just so nobody misinterprets my question, which is very much in the spirit of peeling back the layers, all the many drivers that might be pushing women out of public life. And I was particularly interested in the research that you cited, Ms. Gillard, on the treatment of Theresa May versus Margaret Thatcher by the UK press. And I was wondering, because I observed in Australia a somewhat similar phenomenon in the most recent change of leadership to Scott Morrison, where women did withdraw from public life in the Conservative parties because of what they cited as in-party bullying, getting too much for them, even very experienced politicians. And I wonder to what extent is actually the state of the Conservative Party to blame for this phenomenon of the treatment of Theresa May, in particular by Conservative press. There's huge infighting inside of the Conservative Party, many, many factions. And should we not qualify our conclusions about the treatment of women with the actual factions that are there and the extent to which the Conservative media will want to reflect and magnify that?
Julia, I'm going to ask you to answer all three questions on media cleanup, in-party bullying and what's happening in Australia now, and how empires never die quietly.
Okay, I'll do it as quickly as I can. I think what Margaret said before about the difference with Margaret Thatcher is an important thing. I think when we're looking at Theresa May and Margaret Thatcher, yes, the Conservative press backed Margaret Thatcher in hard, and that wasn't true for Theresa May. We've also just seen the degeneration of standards. I mean, back in 1979, no one would have put in the newspaper, the Prime Minister's got a hole in her stockings, or she's got cankles, or she's wearing a hideous jacket or something like that. I mean, press standards were different. Now that sort of almost celebrity lens over female politicians about what they look like and whether they've passed muster is a very regular thing in the media. You would recall the very famous photo of Theresa May and Nicola Sturgeon, both wearing skirts, and the headline being, "Forget Brexit, who won Legsit, who's got the better legs." People would not have published that in 1979. I think that's what's happening in the media. There's a lot of elements, but I think that's what's happening in the media. On the other media question, I think we have to be quite careful about questions of regulation of the media, because we know how that movie ends when governments get too carried away regulating what should be free media and free speech. But I do think, I think for the traditional media, really it's going to be the force of public pressure on these gender questions that forces change. But I do think that there's some regulation issues around social media that we need to debate through. I mean, I couldn't buy an ad in the Times tomorrow saying, X should be raped and then killed, but I could, if I took it into my head, put that on Twitter tonight. Now, it seems to me, let's think that through. Why is it wrong in one space and apparently okay in another space to be projecting those sorts of threats of violence through the media? So there are some regulation questions to be talked through. Obviously, the global social media companies it's very difficult for one nation state to make a difference to their conduct, and so that would require some forms of global cooperation. But I think that that's a very live agenda. On the issue of factions in politics, I'd really echo a lot of what Rosie and others on the panel have said. The Australian Labor Party, as long ago as the early 1990s, adopted an affirmative action target, and that's why Labor is at almost 50% women. If we'd had a slightly better election in May, we would have been at 50% women. And the Conservative Party is in the low 20% for women. And I think some of the cultural questions in the Australian Conservative parties are explained by the continuing low numbers of women. And that's a problem that can be fixed. It can be fixed with a structural solution like Labor's affirmative action target. And there appear now at least to be some Conservatives in Australia who are interested in that. And I think some of the, I'm not putting words in individuals' mouths, but there are some long-standing female Conservatives and male Conservatives who have been prepared to say, I used to think all of this quota stuff was nonsense, but now I'm, more and more attracted to it. So I think hopefully we'll see some cultural change through that. Empires don't die quietly. I broadly agree with that. In the sense that, history tells us that people rarely cede power willingly. But I am, optimistic enough to believe that there are a lot of men out there who actually realise that a more gender equal future is a better future for men too, because it's not just women who suffer from stereotyping and need to live their lives with sort of gender prisms around them. Men have that set of issues too, though playing out differently in their lives. And so I think that there is a coalition here between men and women who want to see change that is perhaps a different dynamic than just the powerful and the less, the people with less power having a clash like the end of empires has tended to be in the past.
Good. We'll have two last questions, and then I'll ask just perhaps each member of the panel to give a few brief reflections there. We had one, two, or I'd take one more with you there, if you want to start.
Thank you. My name is Julian Karen Cumberledge. I'm a guest of an alum. I'm also the co-founder of a board search firm, and 50% of our appointments are female, so it can be done. But I would agree with what the panel has really emphasised tonight, that the positions of real power are the positions that are tremendously important. And if we look across to companies, we see that the number of female chairs is at about 6% in the FTSE 100 and hasn't really moved. And so my question is, should we be really focusing on power? That actually we could address a lot of the issues that have been raised tonight if women were running the media companies, if women were more influential in Parliament, if women, if there were more female chairs of major businesses? Or should we be waiting to that sort of radical disruption that maybe climate change will bring, that will just need a completely different solution forward? And my sense is a real focus on power, women in power, helping us all to become more comfortable with women in power might be a good use of research, a real focal point for addressing a number of the issues that we've raised tonight.
Thank you. I'm going to ask all of the panel to reflect on that. Would you pass over there and then we'll finish here.
Hi, my name is Caroline English. Julia, you opened by asking what are we role modelling if you can't be what you can't see. There's lots of things that are quite dire about young women getting into politics. What do you think, if you could pick one circuit breaker, what would it be?
Okay, and then a final question here.
I'm Mitchell. I'm Australian, living in London, working in political campaigning. Commented on the Conservative media's ability and willingness to attack Conservative candidates and Conservative women. What chance does a progressive woman have against that kind of backdrop? And is the solution to that to change the media landscape somehow, to duplicate the Conservative media in some way to better reflect what I assume you on the panel would be trying to get across in that environment?
Great. So I think what we've got is a kind of fundamental question is not dissimilar to should we create our own parliament? Yeah. But if there are going to be radical disruptions to the way we live, should we be focusing on actually creating power to the side and being ready for that radical disruption is there one thing that we can do to get women into power? And then how do you actually be a progressive woman? And can you actually just need to step outside the Conservative Party altogether there? Do you want to start, Mary?
Okay, to start. I think on the question of getting more women into Parliament and the power, let's just forget for one moment what's happening, but we take that forward as well, is if it started but not fast enough, and Parliament itself and women themselves have to take the power, that the hours of Parliament have to change. Because we know from myself and others that you come in at lunchtime and go till 10 and 11 o'clock at night. You have committees in the afternoon instead of in the mornings. But if the whole, some people say it's always been like that. Well, it hasn't got to always be like that. But if the British parliamentary system changed, like some local governments have changed, that the parliamentary day starts like anybody else going to work. You know, that you work from 9 till 5 or 9 a bit later. And then that you had other times left and more, and because of what's happened with violence, that more and more members of Parliament are doing video conferencing with their constituents and others. That, I think, also, besides the bullying that's going on that we have to tackle, which others will, is if we change the whole way that Parliament operates in terms of hours and in terms of attendance and so on. That could make a big difference in a turnaround of 5 years to get more women of every age interested and wanting to be in Parliament.
So we don't need so much of a radical disruptive change, but a really simple one, like starting your day at 9 o'clock.
Yes,
what a radical
and
idea.
Have pressures as well.
Margaret.
Well, there's a whole range of layers of this, isn't there? I do agree that we shouldn't simply concentrate on the world of politics. The question of the media has come up more than once this evening, but we need more women on boards of corporate bodies. The public sector could do quite a lot here by encouraging women who are up and coming within the civil service, for example, or local government, encouraging them to take seats on boards of other bodies, therefore giving them experience and knowledge of how to be a board member and to increase, obviously, the numbers of women on boards. When I sat on the board of the Royal Mail, I was the only woman. If this is like ridiculous in 1999 or whatever it was, it's just completely daft. So I think we need more women in those kinds of positions. I think we always have to bear in mind that, you can kind of have a hissy fit. You can kind of go a bit, bonkers about what it is you want to do. But at the end of the day, you have to bring people with you. So making sure you bring people with, and quite often you have to do that by looking at their own self-interest. So, for example, when I did the Women and Work Commission report, which was a long time ago now, more than 10 years ago now, we worked out then, the economists in the old Department of Trade and Industry worked out that the loss of women's contribution in the workplace, because they were held back, and no decent part-time jobs, etc., that was £12 billion a year then. The country and the government is losing money by not enabling more women to participate and to move forward. One of the problems we have in this country, which many other countries don't have, of course, is our public school system. And, we have currently a Prime Minister, a product of Eton. I have to say, if I was his mother, I would ask Eton for my money back. They clearly have not educated him in any way whatsoever. A person who's gone through that kind of expensive education, he's so ill-mannered, so lazy, I just find it extraordinary. But he's born to rule. And David Cameron was born to rule. And we've had a few too many of these people in our government in this country. And, that's a big, big problem. And all male and all female schools are a big, big problem. So we need to kind of work on a number of those things as well. This is not going to all happen tomorrow. We've all got to just keep on going and keep on pushing and keep on embarrassing those men who think that it's quite funny to be rude or to be high-handed about women. We have to show them up for that.
Well, I think we should all be very wary of people who say we'll get to gender equality after the revolution. We've heard it before. And, you know, climate change is a massive problem, but there's no reason we can't tackle climate change at the same time as thinking about gender equality. So I am absolutely with you. We need to focus on power, which is why King's, with Julia, have set up the Global Institute for Women's Leadership. And in terms of what should progressive women do, I think there is some hope out there. We've talked about the perils of social media, but I'm thinking about Cortez in the United States. Actually, sometimes you can cut through and find an audience and find a way to communicate that actually isn't possible with traditional media, which could be really helpful. And that's me.
The last word.
Just on the climate change point, this is a fact that's close to my heart, given my belief in education. But economists who study best buys on climate change, what would make the biggest difference for the least expenditure, end up pointing to girls' education because educated women choose to have fewer children. If every girl on the planet today had a secondary level education, then peak global population would be 2 billion less than is anticipated. Now, that obviously is skewed distributionally in terms of where there are high birth rates in the world. So you are talking about 2 billion people who are lower carbon intensive human beings than us. But at the end of the day, 2 billion times a small amount is still a big amount. And so one of the best things that we can do in pursuit of climate change action is to also work on gender equality at the same time. I think, ultimately, across this discussion, we've talked about threads about women equality, media, and I would say on your question on the media that I think whilst we did have a discussion about how two conservative women were treated differently, Margaret Thatcher and Prime Minister May, overwhelmingly, because the media tends to be conservative, it's progressive women who have had the biggest payout from traditional media. But we've talked about all of those threads. I think it looks fairly dire at the moment, but longer term, I'm an optimist. I think we're in a change era where the change in technology, new media, social media, we spent more than a decade now all staring at our phones, and I think you can already see some green shoots that people are starting to say, we want to live differently, we want to get information differently, the advent of slow media rather than quick media. I think this is part of the green shoots. I think this cycle of hyper-partisanship in politics will actually come to an end. I think it could get a bit worse before it gets better. But I think ultimately it will get better because people will become too frustrated with the stasis that this kind of hyper-partisanship brings. They'll want to see more action in politics, more change, and they'll recognise that scattering to the extremes doesn't facilitate that. What I think we've got to do as all of those changes unfold is make sure that there's a key focus on gender equality, because we can plan for a future with gender as an afterthought. We get to the future and then say to each other, gee, we still haven't fixed that gender thing. Or we can plan for the future with gender squarely in our sights so that that future is a more gender equal one. And obviously our mission at the Global Institute for Women's Leadership is to try and achieve that. And it is always best done by shining a light on problems, which is why discussions like this one are so important.
Thank you. Well, we're going to end on that optimistic note and on that absolutely, from my point, shameless plug for the Global Institute for Women's Leadership. Do go onto our website, look at the research that we're doing, because I think what we've agreed is that pulling back the layers of what pushes women out of politics, but also pulls them into public life, is absolutely crucial there. Can I finish by saying thank you to Michael Scott for bringing us all together, to Georgetown and to Las Casas and Oxford there for sponsoring this wonderful event, one of many that will carry on through there, and to my colleagues at King's College London who've helped to manage the day-to-day processes of getting us all here there. There will be drinks across the way there, so there'll be a chance for informal conversation. But meanwhile, can we say thank you to our wonderful panel? Thank you. Thank you.